The 17th of January 1944. Above the frozen fields of Brandenburg, 28,000 feet. The air is so thin it burns. Frost creeps across the canopy glass like fingers of death, and every breath through the oxygen mask tastes of rubber and fear. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler tightens his grip on the control column of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, G6, eyes scanning the pale winter sky. Below, the patchwork of German farmland lies silent under snow. Above, only the endless blue, and somewhere in that blue, the Americans. He has been flying for 3 years. He has seen the Spitfires over the Channel, the Hurricanes over France, the lumbering Soviet bombers that fell like burning leaves. But this is different. The radio crackles. A voice, tight with panic. Achtung! Mustangs! Hi! They are above us! Stigler's head snaps upward. There, where no escort fighter should be, where the air is too thin and the cold too savage, he sees them. Silver flashes catching the sun. American P-51 Mustangs, and they are climbing still. For the first time in his career, Franz Stigler feels the cold creep not from the altitude, but from within. To understand this moment, this fracture in the myth of German air superiority, we must step back to the summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe ruled the skies over Europe like gods of war. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, in its early variants, was a masterpiece. It could climb faster than anything the Allies fielded. It could turn tighter than the Hurricane. It could dive away from the Spitfire and live to fight again. Hermann Göring, corpulent and confident, promised Hitler that no Allied bomber would ever reach Berlin. And for a time, he was nearly right. The 109 was the sword of the Reich, and every pilot who sat in its narrow cockpit believed himself invincible. But wars are not won by machines alone. They are won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by the ability to replace what is lost and improve what remains. And in this, the Reich was already doomed, though it did not yet know it. Across the Atlantic, in the vast factories of Detroit and Burbank and Inglewood, a different kind of war machine was being born. Not just fighters and bombers, but an entire system of production that could turn raw steel into airplanes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The Americans were coming, and they were bringing mathematics. In the summer of 1940, the United States Army Air Corps issued a specification. They needed a long-range escort fighter, something that could shepherd the heavy bombers, those flying fortresses and liberators all the way to Berlin and back. The problem was physics. Every fighter in the world faced the same cruel equation: fuel or performance. Carry enough fuel to fly deep into Germany, and your fighter becomes a pig, slow and heavy, easy meat for the nimble 109 seconds. Strip out the fuel to stay light and fast, and your bombers die alone over the Ruhr. For years, this seemed unsolvable. The RAF had tried. The Luftwaffe itself had tried. All had failed. Enter North American Aviation and a young engineer named Edgar Schmood. Schmood was German by birth, a fact that would have amused the men he was about to help destroy. He approached the problem differently. Instead of brute force, he used elegance. The P-51 Mustang was designed around a laminar flow wing, a radical shape that reduced drag to an almost theoretical minimum. Mated to the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same that powered the Spitfire, the result was a fighter that could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything else in the sky. It could carry 269 gallons of fuel internally, and with drop tanks, over 400. It could cruise at 25,000 feet and fight at 40,000. And critically, it could do all of this while still outperforming the Bf 109 inches every measurable way. The first P-51Bs arrived in England in late 1943. The pilots who flew them were young, many still in their early 20s, products of an American training system that was pumping out aviators at an industrial pace. They had heard stories of the Luftwaffe aces, men with hundreds of kills, men who flew like devils. They were told the 109 was faster in a dive, deadlier in a climb, flown by veterans who had been fighting since Spain. They were told they might not come home, but they were also told something else. They were told their airplane was better. The first encounters were cautious, almost tentative. German pilots, accustomed to the limited range of the Thunderbolts and Lightnings, would see the American bombers approaching and calculate, "The escorts will turn back soon. We wait. We strike when they are alone." But the Mustangs did not turn back. They stayed. And when the 109 seconds climbed to intercept, expecting to hold the altitude advantage as they always had, they found the Mustangs already there, waiting, higher still, silver sharks circling in the thin air. Lieutenant Heinz Noak, a veteran pilot with over 400 combat missions, recorded his first encounter with a P-51 inches his diary. "We climbed to engage what we thought was a P-47 formation. But as we approached, they climbed away from us easily, effortlessly. We pushed our throttles to the stops, our engines screaming, and still they rose. For the first time, I felt what the British must have felt in 1940. I felt hunted. This was the psychological wound, deeper than any bullet hole. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had owned the vertical dimension. The 109's climb rate was legendary. It could pull itself into the sky like a rocket, gaining altitude faster than any Allied fighter. This was doctrine, drilled into every German pilot. If you are in trouble, climb. The enemy cannot follow. But now, the enemy could follow. Worse, the enemy could be above you before the fight even started. Major Gunther Rohl, who would survive the war with 275 confirmed kills, described it with the precision of a man who understood exactly what was happening. The Mustang changed the mathematics of survival. Before, we could dictate the terms of engagement. We chose when to fight and when to run. Against the Mustang, those choices were taken from us. It could chase us anywhere. It could catch us at any altitude, and there were so many of them, so many. This was the other blade of the American sword. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force could put up 1,000 bombers on a single raid, and with them, hundreds of Mustangs. The production lines in California were running day and night, 3 shifts, pumping out P-51 seconds at a rate the Germans could not comprehend. North American Aviation built 15,586 Mustangs during the war. Messerschmitt built 33,984 Bf 109 seconds of all variants. But by 1944, fuel shortages, pilot losses, and the relentless Allied bombing campaign meant that only a fraction could be put into the air at any one time. The numbers were crushing. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 1,311 pilots killed, wounded, or missing. In February, 1,104. In March, 1,568. These were not just numbers, they were the men who had fought over Poland and France, over the Channel and Russia. They were the instructors, the aces, the backbone of the fighter force, and they were dying in a sky that suddenly belonged to someone else. What did it feel like, that loss of dominance? The records offer glimpses, fragments of a collective trauma. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a highly decorated ace, wrote after the war of a growing sense of helplessness, of fighting a war we could no longer win. He described missions where his squadron would take off with 18 aircraft and return with 9, where pilots would bail out over their own territory and be back in the air the next day, only to be shot down again, where the smell of burning fuel and melting rubber became so familiar it no longer registered as unusual. The young men who climbed into the 109's cramped cockpit in 1944 were not the confident warriors of 1940. They were products of a training system that had collapsed under the weight of attrition. In 1940, a Luftwaffe pilot received over 200 hours of flight training before his first combat mission. By 1944, that number had dropped to 50, sometimes less. They were sent into battle barely able to land their own aircraft, let alone dogfight with men who had flown twice as many hours. The Americans, meanwhile, were training pilots with 400 hours before combat in an unbroken pipeline that stretched from primary trainers in Texas to operational squadrons in England. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann was 19 years old when he flew his first mission in a Bf 109G 14 inches March, 1944. He had logged exactly 47 hours in the aircraft. His diary, recovered after the war, contains a single entry from that day. I saw the Mustangs, and I knew I was going to die. I did not know if it would be today or tomorrow, but I knew. He survived 6 missions. On the 7th, over Brunswick, a P-51 flown by Lieutenant James Goodson caught him in a climbing turn and shot him down. Hoffmann bailed out with burns over 30% of his body. He never flew again. This was the other terror. Not just that the Mustang could climb higher, but that behind the stick was often a pilot who had been training for this moment since before Pearl Harbor, who had flown across an ocean in a bomber to get here, who was part of a machine so vast and so confident that it could afford to lose 100 aircraft in a single day and return the next morning with 100 more. The symbolic object of this transformation was not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was altitude itself. Altitude, which had always been safety, had become a trap. The German pilots would push their 109 seconds to 30,000 feet, 32,000, even 35,000 inches, desperation, the engines coughing and sputtering in the thin air, the controls sluggish, the frost so thick on the canopy they could barely see. And there, impossibly high, would be the Mustangs, waiting, patient. The Americans called it top cover, a term that conveyed both tactical doctrine and psychological dominance. We are above you. We own the sky. The records show that the kill ratio shifted dramatically. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters were still scoring roughly 1-to-1 against American fighters. By mid-1944, that ratio had reversed to nearly 4, 1 inch favor of the Americans. The reasons were multiple pilot training, numbers, logistics, but the psychological impact of the Mustang's altitude performance cannot be overstated. Interviews with surviving Luftwaffe pilots return again and again to the same phrase. They were always above us. Oberstleutnant Hannes Trotloft, who commanded JG-54, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, wrote in his post-war memoir of a mission in April 1944, where his squadron intercepted a bomber formation near Magdeburg. We climbed to 28,000 feet, expecting to have the altitude advantage as always. But when we arrived, the Mustangs were already at 32,000, circling like eagles. We could not reach them. We could only wait for them to dive on us, which they did. We lost 7 aircraft in 4 minutes. Not one bomber was touched. 4 minutes. 7 aircraft. And not one bomber touched. This was the new arithmetic of the air war, and it was killing the Luftwaffe faster than any weapon system in history. But the Mustang's dominance was not just a matter of altitude, it was also range. The Bf 109, in its late war variants, had a combat radius of approximately 350 miles. The P-51D, with drop tanks, could fly 1,000 miles from its base, fight for 30 minutes, and return. This meant that nowhere in the Reich was safe. Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, Munich, cities that had once been beyond the reach of escorted bombers were now within easy range. The psychological impact on both the German military and civilian population was devastating. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, known as Big Week, a sustained series of raids against German aircraft production facilities. The Mustangs flew every mission, often exceeding 700 miles one way. Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them and were slaughtered. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost over 450 fighters and, more critically, 300 pilots. Many were veterans, men who could not be replaced. The head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, Adolf Galland, said later, "Big Week broke the back of the German fighter force. After that, we were simply trying to survive." The German pilots knew this. They could feel the Air Force dying around them. The Me-262 jet fighter, which appeared in small numbers in late 1944, offered a brief technological reprieve, but there were too few of them, too late, and no fuel to fly them. The Mustang, meanwhile, kept coming. Day after day, week after week, an endless silver tide. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski, an ace with 197 kills, described the summer of 1944 as the summer of death. He flew 3 missions a day, every day, for 6 weeks. We took off knowing we were outnumbered 5-1. We climbed knowing they would be above us. We fought knowing we would lose friends. And we landed, if we landed, knowing we would do it again tomorrow. The Mustang did not just beat us in the air, it beat us in our minds. Psychological warfare. Though the Americans did not call it that. They simply built more airplanes, trained more pilots, and flew more missions. The industrial capacity of the United States was something the German High Command had fundamentally miscalculated. They had assumed, in 1941, that America was soft, unprepared, incapable of translating its industrial wealth into military power quickly enough to matter. They were wrong. By 1944, the United States was producing more aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in a year. The P-51 was not just a fighter. It was a symbol of that industrial tsunami, proof that the Reich was fighting not just an army, but an entire continent's economy. The German soldiers and pilots who had expected a quick war, a victorious war, a war of ideological triumph, found themselves instead in a grinding attritional nightmare. They had been told that American soldiers were weak, that American pilots were poorly trained, that American equipment was inferior. The propaganda machine had fed them these lies so thoroughly that the truth, when it arrived at 30,000 feet in the form of a silver fighter that could outclimb them, was almost incomprehensible. Unteroffizier Klaus Fischer, shot down twice and wounded once, said in a post-war interview, "We were told the Americans had no stomach for war, that they were only in it for money, and would quit when it got hard. Then I saw them. They flew through flak that would have turned us back. They followed us into the clouds, into the sun, down to the deck. They did not quit. And their airplanes, God, their airplanes were beautiful, fast and deadly, and there were so many. I stopped believing anything I was told after that." This was the ideological wound. The Nazi state had built itself on myths of racial superiority, of German technical and martial excellence, but the Mustang disproved all of it. It was designed by an emigrant, built by a nation the Nazis dismissed as mongrel and weak, flown by young men who had been civilians 3 years earlier. And it was better. Not just better in some abstract sense, but better in every measurable way that mattered in combat, faster, higher, farther, and in the hands of men who truly believed that they were fighting for something worth dying for. The American pilots, for their part, felt this too. They understood they were flying the best fighter in the world, and it gave them a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, who would finish the war with 24 aerial victories, said, "We knew the 109 could dive fast and climb well, but we also knew that if we kept our speed up, if we stayed disciplined, we could beat them every time. The P-51 gave us options the Germans didn't have. We could choose to fight or not fight. We could follow them anywhere. That's what air superiority actually is, not just winning fights, but deciding when they happen." There is a recording, scratchy and faint, of a radio transmission from the 6th of March 1944 during a raid on Berlin. An American pilot, call sign Red Dog, is pursuing a Bf 109 inches a steep climb. His wingman warns him that the 109 is pulling away. Red Dog responds, calm and certain, "He's not pulling away, he's running out of air." 20 seconds later, guns, guns, guns. Splash 109. The German pilot, whoever he was, bailed out. The Mustang followed him down to 10,000 feet to make sure the parachute opened, then climbed back to rejoin the bomber stream. This was mercy, perhaps, or professionalism, or simply the certainty that the war was already won. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over Western Europe. The Mustangs roamed freely, strafing airfields, trains and trucks, hunting the few remaining German fighters like wolves culling a wounded herd. The diary of Hauptmann Heinz Beer, a 220-kill ace, records the moment he realized it was over. The 12th of June, 1944. We took off to intercept a bomber raid. We were 12 aircraft. We saw perhaps 200 Mustangs. We did not engage. What would be the point? I landed, and I knew we had lost the war. This was the transformation, from hunters to hunted, from confident warriors to desperate survivors. And it happened not in a single apocalyptic battle, but in 1,000 small defeats, 1,000 moments when a German pilot looked up and saw a Mustang where no fighter should be able to reach, 1,000 times when the engine coughed and the wings shuddered and the American fighter climbed away, effortlessly, into the thin blue nothing above. The historical evidence is brutal in its clarity. The 8th Air Force lost 4,145 bombers over Europe during the war. But after the Mustang arrived in numbers, the loss rate dropped from over 6% per mission to less than 2%. The difference was escort. The difference was altitude. The difference was the P-51. German fighter losses, meanwhile, skyrocketed. In the first 6 months of 1,944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000. 200 pilots killed in action in the West, a rate of attrition that no air force could sustain. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, the second highest scoring ace in history with 301 kills, survived the war flying mostly on the Eastern Front. He transferred west briefly in early 1944 and was nearly killed by a P-51 over Hanover. He later said, "On the Eastern Front, we fought the Soviets, who were brave and numerous, but often poorly trained and equipped. In the West, we fought the Americans, who were brave and numerous and equipped with aircraft that made ours obsolete. There is no comparison. The Mustang was the best fighter of the war, and it was everywhere, everywhere." That was the final psychological blow. Not just that the Americans had built a better fighter, but that they had built so many of them that the sky itself turned silver. Franz Stigler, who survived the war, said in an interview decades later, "We were not beaten by better men. We were beaten by better systems." The Mustang was not a single airplane. It was the symbol of America, abundant, powerful, confident. We could shoot down 10 and 20 more would take their place. That is not a fight you can win. The recurring symbol, then, is not an object but a presence. The silver glint at 35,000 feet, the fighter that should not be there but is, the predator, in a place that had always been sanctuary. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had used altitude as a weapon, a shield, a tactical advantage. The Mustang took that away. It made the sky democratic, or rather, it made the sky American. After the war, in the ruins of Germany, the United States Army Air Forces conducted an interrogation program of captured Luftwaffe personnel. The transcripts, now declassified, are filled with a kind of exhausted awe. Asked about the P-51, one unidentified major said, "It was not just a fighter. It was a message. It told us, you cannot hide. We will follow you anywhere. Your altitude means nothing. Your experience means nothing. We have more pilots, more fuel, more aircraft, more of everything, and we will keep coming until you are dead or surrender." That is what the Mustang meant. By May 1945, it was over. The Reich collapsed, its cities in ruins, its air force annihilated. The Mustang had done its job. It had escorted the bombers that destroyed the factories. It had shot down the fighters that tried to stop them. It had strafed the trains that carried the fuel and the airfields where the aircraft waited. And it had done all of this while climbing higher than anything the Luftwaffe could field. In the decades that followed, historians and veterans on both sides came to a consensus. The P-51 Mustang was the finest piston-engine fighter of the Second World War. Not because it was perfect, it had flaws, weaknesses, moments where the older designs could exploit a brief advantage, but because it was good enough at everything that mattered. It could escort, it could fight, it could range across an entire continent and return. And in the hands of a well-trained pilot, it was nearly unbeatable. The German pilots who survived carried the memory of it like a scar. Not bitterness, exactly, but a kind of rueful respect. They had believed in their machines, in their training, in their cause, and they had learned that none of it mattered against the weight of American industry and the ruthlessness of American strategy. The Mustang had taught them that wars are not won by the best soldiers, but by the best systems, and the American system, for all its flaws, was better. There is a photograph, taken in 1985, of a reunion between Franz Stigler and Charles Brown, a B-17 pilot Stigler had spared in 1943 rather than shooting down. They became friends, these two old warriors. Asked about the war, he said, "I flew the 109, and I loved it. But I knew, even then, that we were fighting against something we could not defeat. The Mustang proved it. They could climb higher than us. They could go farther. They could do everything we could do, and do it better. That was the day I knew we would lose. The day I looked up and saw them above me." Epilogue. Above the frozen fields of Brandenburg, in the thin, cold air where breath turns to ice and engines scream, there is a lesson written in contrails and wreckage. It is a lesson about hubris and industry, about the myth of superiority and the reality of logistics. The Luftwaffe had believed that skill and will could triumph over material, that the purity of ideology could overcome the weight of numbers. The Mustang disproved this with a simplicity that was almost cruel. The sky does not care about ideology. It cares about thrust-to-weight ratios, about fuel capacity, about the tensile strength of aluminum alloy and the octane rating of gasoline. It cares about the factory workers in California who built 15,000 fighters, and the mechanics in England who kept them flying, and the pilots who climbed into them day after day and flew into a sky filled with death. The sky is not noble or ideological. It is simply space, to be conquered or abandoned. And in 1944, it was conquered by a silver fighter with a laminar flow wing and a Rolls-Royce engine, flown by young men who believed, who knew that their cause was just and their airplane was the best in the world. They climbed higher than the 109 seconds. They flew farther. They won, not because they were inherently better men, but because they were part of a system that valued production over propaganda, abundance over ideology, and victory over myth. The terror the German pilots felt was not the terror of battle, it was the terror of obsolescence, of realizing that the rules had changed, and no amount of skill or courage could change them back. They had ruled the sky for 3 years, and in the span of 6 months, they became prey. The Mustang did not just defeat them, it erased them from the vertical dimension, turned the high blue sanctuary into a killing field, and proved that in modern war, the nation that can build the most will defeat the nation that believes the most. This is the truth the P-51 Mustang taught, written in the contrails at 35,000 feet, where the air is thin and the cold is absolute and the silver fighters circle endlessly, patient and inevitable. The sky belongs to those who can reach it, and in 1944, above the frozen fields of Germany, the Americans reached higher than anyone else. That is the freedom abundance buys. That is the power democracy wields. Not the freedom of the individual pilot, but the freedom of a nation to outproduce, outfly, and outlast any enemy, no matter how skilled or determined. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a promise, kept in fire and aluminum and the blood of young men on both sides, that the war would end only one way. And when it did, the sky was quiet again, empty of the scream of engines and the chatter of guns. But the lesson remained, etched in the memory of every man who had looked up and seen the impossible. A fighter higher than it should be, faster than it had any right to be, and more numerous than any nightmare. The sky had changed owners, and it would never change back.